We are ready to begin, and we'll begin with prayer. Dear Lord God, Heavenly Father, we know that you are in control of all things, and that your Son, ascended on high at your right hand, is ruling over everything for the benefit of your church. That gives us the confidence and courage to push forward always, knowing that with you in control, that everything is going to work for the good of your kingdom. Bless us this evening as we study your word. Help us to see that your fingerprints are on everything in this world and in our lives as you manipulate everything for your glory and our benefit. Amen. So we are on question number 8, Genesis 39, 1 through 6, where we find Joseph having been sold into slavery now, and he's in Potiphar's house. And as you look at the top section there, it says, God uses the next 13 years of Joseph's life to prepare him for the work that God has in store for him. God put Joseph within the inner circle of Egyptian hierarchy. And so as you look at the life of Joseph, we were kind of looking at how tragic it was that the brothers sold him into slavery and all that took place there. And yet this was all God's doing for the benefit of his church, the Old Testament church. Now, question number 8 says, use the following words and phrases to think about the ways God prepared Joseph. Note the timeline. Joseph was a slave in Potiphar's house for... Yeah. I'll get this back up. Was in Potiphar's house for 8 or 9 of the 13 years before he was elevated to second in command of Egypt. And so now, use the following words and phrases to think about that. And let's quick read through Genesis 39, verses 1 through 6a. When Joseph was brought down to Egypt, Potiphar the Egyptian, who was an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard, bought Joseph from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down to Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became successful. He served in the house of his master the Egyptian. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything that he touched a success. Joseph found favor in his sight. Joseph served him, and he made Joseph manager of his household. He put Joseph in charge of everything. From the time that Potiphar made him manager of his household, in charge of everything that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian household for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord rested on everything that he had, both in the house and in the fields. So he left Joseph in charge of everything that he had. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. And again, the food that he ate, he was concerned about because he didn't want who to be preparing it. A non-Egyptian. It was a religious thing, not part of that. And so Joseph was in charge of everything. So you look at what happened now. Joseph sold into slavery, taken by the Ishmaelites into Egypt, put on the auction block. Who could have bought him as a slave? Anyone who had the money. He could have been put to work in the fields. He could have been put to work in a factory, as it were, whatever it might be. But who ended up purchasing him? Potiphar, who was captain of the Pharaoh's guard. So again, the Lord's manipulating things to get him into the upper echelon of Egyptian government for a reason that is there. So now let's look at a couple of things here. First, God's power to bless. Think of the ways God prepared Joseph with God's power to bless. And as you look at this, the Lord's power to bless, how do we see that in what we just read from Genesis 39, the first 6 verses?
We saw that Joseph was sold to a person that had standing, and then he blessed everything he did.
Okay, Joseph didn't do what, but rather did what as a slave? Okay. He didn't complain. He didn't whine and gripe. He didn't say, Lord, what do you do? I'm a slave now, and thus do just a bare minimum. He faithfully worked wherever he was put. Now remember, he had gone from what position to this position in Potiphar's house? The favorite son of a poor or wealthy person. A very wealthy person. Jacob was wealthy. So he goes from that being the favorite son, all those, what that entailed in that rich person's house, to now a slave in Potiphar's house. He doesn't mope around. He doesn't whine and complain. He faithfully serves the Lord. And what does the Lord do? Blessed him. The Lord blessed him. And so note how this period of Joseph's life begins. This is perhaps the most important lesson that Joseph learned. Through the experiences, Joseph learned that with the Lord's blessings, one can be successful in any venture. And so it didn't matter. You know, it's the same thing like nowadays with people. You have a lot of times, you have corporate downsizing, you have people losing their jobs, and you can have two reactions if you face being part of that, downsized or losing your job. What are the two reactions you can have? Angry and bitter at God, angry and bitter at the company that did that, angry and bitter at life itself, griping, complaining, or what other attitude? Yeah. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps and look for something else. If the one door closes, the Lord's going to open another door. And that's what was with Joseph. And again, Joseph was in a special position because God was using him now to protect his church, protect that family through which the Savior would come, granted. But again, we can relate to that too. God says he works good in all situations for those who love him. And again, we know it mostly is the eternal good, but there's other good that comes through a person who, in spite of the difficulty of life, is just faithful in doing what they do. The Lord's blessings come that way.
He was young, too.
Yeah, he was young. When he was sold into slavery, what age was he? 17. He was 17 years old, you know, and yep. How about the next one? Respect for an Egyptian master. So he had been growing up in his family, household, which was all what? Shepherds, but what race? Jewish, Hebrew. Right, the Jewish race. All of a sudden now he has to be living in what situation, what race? Egyptian. A completely different race with a completely different religion, God, that they worshiped. And now he's a slave in that household, and is just in contact with all of that. And so respect for an Egyptian master, Joseph was given an opportunity to respect the people God put over him. In this case, they were unbelievers, which presented challenges Joseph would face on a national level. In other words, as we're looking at all these things, we see God in various ways preparing Joseph for, because we know the ending of the story, for what? Yeah, when he'd be second in command of a foreign people, but needing to do everything for the good of his family, the church, God's people that is there. And so here he's learning about these foreign people, the various aspects of that. We touched on this already, faithfulness. Whatever situation he was in, and we're going to come whether it's being a slave or being a prisoner, he looked at it as what he was doing as serving whom? God. As serving God. So he's going to be faithful in whatever he does. And again, that's how we look at things too, whatever situation we're in. Whatever, if you want to use the term vocation, which seems to be popular right now in a lot of religious circles, vocation, which is whatever your role is at the particular time you are in. And what are some of the roles that you have? Parent, spouse, worker, unless you're retired, whatever, but you have the different roles that are there and faithfulness in all those roles. Next one, attention. Jason, he was serving God, not people. He practiced being faithful in whatever situation God placed him. Then the next one, attention to detail. Joseph's faithfulness caught the eye of Potiphar. He saw all the blessings that came because of Joseph's faithfulness. He put him in charge of everything, which included what? Everything in the house and in the fields, both. Potiphar, as captain of the guard, was wealthy, so the fields and the household. Verse 5, put him in charge of everything he had, and both the house and in the fields, the Lord's blessings was resting on him. So he's getting a foreshadowing or foretaste of what? As it deals with attention to detail. Leadership and running businesses, as you will. And why would that be important? Again, since we know the end of the story, why would that be important for the future? Yeah, run a country, especially during a time of famine, a natural disaster that hits the whole country, and so attention to detail along the way that and business, if you will, that was there. And so you look at Joseph's responsibilities in Potiphar's household required this quality would become even more important when the lives of many people were at stake. The next one we also talked about business acumen, and just as Joseph rose to power in Potiphar's household, he would have engaged in many business decisions on Potiphar's behalf. Next one, grain storage practices, and we'll just go through these rather quickly. In Potiphar's household, Joseph would have learned how to treat and store crops once they were harvested. And all this becomes very important because when we hit the next lesson, we get into Joseph's dreams when, Pharaoh's dreams. When Joseph told the dreams, he said, here's what God has revealed. He didn't take credit for himself. So he told what it meant, the 7 good years of plenty, then the 7 years of famine. He didn't stop with just telling what the dream meant, but he goes on to give him advice. This is what you should do to prepare for it. Where did he learn all that? Right here, with what he all had to do there. Same thing with the Egyptian culture. He's immersed in that Egyptian culture so he could learn it, so he could deal with the people on their level. Again, he had one of the things we just had a pastor's conference, and the big thing at the pastor's conference was talking about culture and how important it is that you know the culture. And he had to learn the culture of Egypt from a position not as a lowly slave working in some little factory somewhere, but the culture of royalty, the culture of leadership, the culture of government, which is a culture in and of itself that is there. And so he needed to be immersed, in Egyptian culture for a fairly long time to learn its fine points. Language, he had to learn the language of this, and then political life among Egypt's elite. Potiphar was an important man in Pharaoh's court. After Joseph rose to a prominent place in Potiphar's household, you can imagine him being present at important parties or political events, being privy to high-level conversations, and perhaps even serving as Potiphar's advisor or political sounding board. This would have given him wisdom to live in Pharaoh's court, especially in view of his rapid rise to power and the fact that he was a foreigner. And so you see all these things that sometimes we think of him being a slave in Potiphar's house, just a slave. He wasn't just a slave. He was an important part of that household, gaining knowledge about the whole aspect of even running politics and running a country that was there. All this was serving a purpose, training him for what would later on need to be done. Going on, administration of people. As the chief steward of Potiphar's household, he would have to learn to work with those under him. He would have had to solve their interpersonal problems, and he would have gone to God for wisdom to work with these people in a wise and God-pleasing way. And so it taught him how to work with others and deal with others. One of the most difficult things of being a manager is not so much the tasks of the job that is there, but is what? The personnel. That's usually one of the toughest things. And there are some people who can't deal with it, who don't want to deal with it, and so they could never become a manager because of that very thing. Again, how important he had this opportunity to learn that way. Then the whole aspect of authority over other people. Joseph would have learned how to exercise authority over other people so as to reflect well on the God he worshiped. And then finally, patience. In the midst of unjust suffering, Joseph would have had to put himself in the Lord's hands and remain faithful to his work, not knowing how the Lord was using the years of slavery for the good of his kingdom. And so again, patience. And how many of you are patient people? I'm not. And so the Lord has to teach patience over and over and over again. If something needs to get, if I need to do something or have it should be done now. I don't want a doctor appointment 3 months down the line. I want it tomorrow. Get it done, get it over with, that is there. And so throughout all this, Joseph's learning patience. But the interpersonal dealings, how to face setbacks and all those things, all of it, God was using to prepare Joseph, not just for the running of the country, but also for dealing with whom? His family. Once they came back, how to deal with the family, using authority, which he did. If you recall his interaction with his brothers, dealing with authority and yet dealing with compassion as you see later on with all of that. And so patience. In the midst of unjust suffering, Joseph would have had to put himself in the Lord's hands and remain faithful to his work, not knowing how the Lord was using the years of slavery for the good of his kingdom. And we'll just skip over the next one. Can you think of other phrases? Again, you can look through and see other things that the Lord was all doing for Joseph. Question number 9. Even as Joseph put himself into God's hands and enjoyed great success, he continued to suffer. How might the following thoughts have troubled Joseph? I'm in slavery, but my brothers are free. Living in freedom. It's not fair. God, it's not fair that I'm a slave. And he wasn't a slave for just a few months. It was years. 13 years before finally he comes to Pharaoh's attention in that. 13 years. Age 30. Goes in at 17. And yet he doesn't go into that whining stage. Not fair, not fair, not fair, Lord. You've put me in this situation. Now you come through with it. And I'm enslaved and my brothers are living in freedom. Or my father is wealthy and powerful and he loves me dearly. Why hasn't he come looking for me, tried to find me? Because at this point, Joseph didn't know the report that the brothers had given to their father, which was, he's dead. Here's the coat. Here's the blood. He's dead. And so, why isn't Dad looking for me? Why isn't coming to find me? Or, I'm child of Abraham, yet here I am, slave in Egypt. They knew the promise given to Abraham that that land would be his, and that he'd be blessed his family with many descendants, but there be that land of Canaan, and yet here I am, a slave in Egypt. And again, he could have sunk to that depth. He didn't. Whatever position the Lord gave him, he'd do the best in that decision. Now, question number 10, we know the end of the story, but Joseph didn't. Here we go. And we do not know the end of the story of our lives. How might we use Joseph's years in slavery as an encouragement in the dark and mysterious times of life when we seem to be in slavery to hostile forces around us? In other words, what can we learn from Joseph's dealing with bad situations to help us when we face those things in life? Yeah. Be a faithful servant. Make the best of it. And we can make the best of it because we know who's in control. God. And Jesus is with us to the very end of the age. And so, again, whatever situation we find ourselves in, it's not like we're hopeless, helpless. We have the Lord there. And so what do? You just serve faithfully. You don't just sit back and say, okay, Lord, you deliver me, and do nothing. Whatever the situation is, you face it, and you just bear with it, knowing that the Lord is still working good through all things. All right, let's turn.
I've been thinking about this since last week when we were talking about how Joseph was not picking up on social cues very well with his family.
Yeah.
Like, here's my dreams in this, and you're going to serve me in this. And the idea of maybe an autism or a savant of some kind was there. Like, he just didn't pick up on social cues very well, maybe.
I think not that so much as he was a spoiled kid. He was a spoiled child. I mean, his father loved him more than anything. I mean, he's being spoiled by his father. His brothers are older. They're out working in the fields. And so he's got all this attention from his father, and it doesn't dawn on him what he's doing to his brothers.
Special from God because he's getting these dreams.
Yeah. And so it's easy, like, I think we talked about this last time. It's easy to come down on Joseph and just say, yeah, you didn't do a very good job there. You egged your brothers on, et cetera, et cetera. But it also was the Lord doing that so that the brothers would end up selling him into slavery. It's just, we talked last week about how Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead just 2 miles from Jerusalem. And the first time he did something like that so close to Jerusalem rather than up in Galilee, and it was to egg them on so that we need to get rid of him. We got to get rid of him. He's going to have a big following. Look, he raised someone from the dead. We have to get rid of him. So it was all part of the plan that was there. I just think, to me, it seems like he was more spoiled. And think about that. You go from being a spoiled kid, spoiled by your father and that, to being a slave where you have no say-so over your life. Basically, you have to do whatever you're told to do. You're someone else's property. They actually bought you, spent money to buy you, so you're their property. So you go from this status to way down here, and yet what does he do? It wasn't autistic or savant. I'm going to faithfully serve the Lord. Yep.
He must have had some real people skills too. A young guy coming into a situation like that and moving up the ladder, he must have had a lot of people that were unhappy that was going on, and he had to deal with all of that.
He had to deal with, like I said, that's interpersonal skills that he had to learn, which is dealing with people is some of the hardest situation. At the conference, I was talking with Pastor Bublitz he's over at Heritage and that, and we were talking, someone came up and said, well, are either you thinking of starting a school? We both looked at each other and said, no, we've been there with schools, and you're just dealing with that many more interpersonal relationships that make life more difficult. And we got too close enough. And he said the same thing. We don't need that. But, I mean, his was a definite no. I've been there, done that, and don't want to do it anymore, But it's the more people that you have to deal with, et cetera, on a called worker level and that, and it just makes it more difficult because people are people, and they all have their own personalities, their own weaknesses, strengths, and failings, and we all do, and that, and so it's a little bit more difficult. But he had to learn all of that. And he had, he's in Potiphar's house, and he's learning all the ins and outs of the politics of the day, of the politics of the court. He's learning, getting in, being part of Potiphar's house. It talked about him having parties and that, and he'd get to know these important people and everything else. This was all preparing him. And then what happens next, as we're going to see, lesson 4 is a step backwards, a step closer to Pharaoh. He gets thrown in prison, but not just any old prison. He gets thrown in the king's prison, the Pharaoh's prison. Well, who was in that one? You had it'd be like, you have maximum security prison, then you have the other prison where Martha Stewart goes and that. So he's in contact with these important business people who are thrown in, political people who are thrown in. Doesn't get any more political than the chief cupbearer for the king, the one who had to drink everything to make sure he wasn't poisoned, who would always be at the Pharaoh's side. It's all God's doing in all of this, and yet throughout it all, Joseph had to be patient. He just had to say, God, there's some reason for this, so I'm just going to serve faithfully in whatever role you put me. At this point, remember, you're not yet to Mount Sinai, and the giving of the Pentateuch that was there by Moses. And so how did they get the word of God? It would have been transmitted. Just like a lot of other cultures, verbal transmission. So if you will, you look at his 17 years in his father Jacob's house, where he should have been going out into the fields. He wasn't, and probably that's where he was more indoctrinated in the word than even his brothers, because they were out working and he wasn't. And you could say, well, he was being spoiled. Maybe that's how God instilled the word in him, so that when he did got sold into slavery and go through all these things, he had that word memorized and learned that was there. So again, throughout it all, you see God's fingerprints in all of that. So as we continue on now, lesson 4, a step backwards, a step closer to Pharaoh. A step backwards. So here he is, sold into slavery. What a bummer. Way down here. But he's elevated to being top in Potiphar's house, way up here. But now a step backwards, way down here again. So as we look at that, the introduction. The hatred and treachery of Joseph's brothers landed Joseph where God wanted him, in the household of a man close to the king of Egypt. Now the lusts and lies of another person transferred Joseph to a place that was even closer to Pharaoh, the place where high-level criminals and people who displeased Pharaoh were confined. And so let's continue on. We're going to read now Genesis 39, 6b through 20, 6b through 20. Joseph was well built and handsome. Sometime after all this, his master's wife had her eye on Joseph, and she said, "Come lie down with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not concern himself with anything that has been entrusted to me in the house. He's put me in charge of everything that he has. He has no one in this house greater than I am, and he has not withheld anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a great evil and sin against God?" And it's really interesting if you look at the Hebrew there, the word for sin that is used there is literally translated "miss the mark." There's a lot of different words for sin. Transgression. What does transgression mean? Transgress, walk across the line being God's perfection that is there. But miss the mark, how could I, to me that's always one of the neatest words to use with sin, because what idea is behind miss the mark?
Like you're shooting at a target and it goes off to the other.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter if you miss the mark by 1/8 of an inch or 8 miles. You've done the same thing. Miss the mark. And we tend to quantify sin as, oh, that one's really bad, but that's really not that bad. But in God's eyes, it's all missing the mark. So it's all the same thing. It all carries the same weight.
And this is as good as a mile.
Yeah. Whoever hates his brother is a murderer. Hate, actual murder, same thing in God's eyes, missing the mark. Whoever looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Lust, actual adultery, same thing in God's eyes, because it's all missing the mark that is there. And that's a word that is used here. How could I do such a great evil and miss the mark against God, sin against God? And notice what is in his mind. He said, "My master's put everything in charge of me except for you." But he doesn't say, if I do this, I'm going to sin against Potiphar. How could I do such an evil thing and sin against God? And so he looked at a sin as, this is really an affront to God that is there. Well, going on, this is a soap opera, Spanish soap opera maybe. She kept speaking to Joseph day after day, but he would not listen to her. He would not lie down beside her or even be with her. And so she kept going after him, but it seems like people were in the household, and so he could keep refusing her until verse 11. But one day when he went into the house to do his work, none of the men of the household were there inside the house. She caught him by his garment and said, "Come lie down with me." He left behind his garment in her hand and ran outside. So he was in a situation now, he's alone with her. And she is pressuring and pressuring. And so what does he do? Runs away, takes himself outside that situation where he's going to be tempted. Something that a lot of people have to learn, that you don't put yourself in temptation's way. That if the temptation's there, if it's becoming real difficult, what do? Leave or turn it off or whatever else it might be. Or get rid of it if it's alcohol or drugs or whatever. But get yourself out of that situation, which is what he did. Ran outside, leaving his garment behind. Verse 13, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had run outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "Look, my husband has brought a Hebrew man in to put us to shame. He came in to lie down with me, but I screamed loudly. When he heard me scream, he left behind his garment with me and ran outside." And so her story was a change of the truth, a retelling of the truth. And what is she basically saying that Joseph did? Tried to rape her, and she screamed, and so he ran off. Do you think, we don't know, this is all just thinking, but do you think the men would have bought that story? They would have known. I mean, the only reason why she went as far as she did, grabbing his cloak and that, was because what was different about this time? No one was in the house. None of the men were in the house.
Leave before he showed up.
What was that?
Because she got them all to leave before he showed
Yeah.
up.
Yep. And so again, here's her master plan. She's finally going to be able to have sex with him, and he says no. He runs out, and so she completely changes it. Verse 16, she kept his garment beside her until his master came home. In other words, she was determined to get her revenge on Joseph. Nothing is as bad as a woman scorned. And so she was going to get her revenge. She kept it beside her until the master came home. Verse 17, this is what she told him. The Hebrew servant whom you have brought to us came to me to put me to shame and said to me, let me lie down with you. And look, when I screamed and cried out, he left behind his garment with me and ran outside. And so your servant, the one you put with me, it's your fault too. Just like when Adam and Eve sinned, the woman you gave me, God, the slave you brought into the house, Potiphar, he tried to rape me, and that, et cetera, et cetera. Verse 19, as soon as the master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, this is what your servant did to me, he became very angry. And again, we talked about this last time in a little preview of this. He became very angry. About what? Losing a valuable servant who ran his whole household. Because he knew he had to do something about this. His wife is accusing that slave of rape. She had already told the other men, the other slaves and servants of the house. It was a known public thing. So,
And she's saying it's all your fault.
But again, you say, what's he angry about? Okay, of course, losing a valuable servant. But also angry probably at whom? His wife.
Similar situation the king was in that put Daniel in the lion's den.
Yeah. Only, there it was the king's own doing that did that because of, no one can, for the next month, no one can worship anyone but the king. But as you look at that, you kind of know that he didn't believe his wife. Why? Well, let's read on. Verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison where the king's prisoners were confined, so Joseph was kept in prison there. So how does that show us that that Potiphar probably did not believe his wife, but knew exactly what had happened? Yeah, put him in the king's prison. Someone who tried to rape your wife gets it into a posh prison, as it were? And a slave. I mean, in those days, if a slave tried anything like that, it would have been immediate execution, death. But it's not. He had to do something. He couldn't lose face. He had to do something about it. And so he puts him in the king's prison. A step backwards. Or was it? Or was it a step forward? And who would be there in the king's prison again? Well, God was there, but who would be the other prisoners? He's not in a prison where there's murderers, rapists, thieves, or anyone else. He's in a prison where many of the prisoners are what type of prisoners? Political prisoners. The chief baker displeased the Pharaoh. The cupbearer displeased Pharaoh. Throw him into prison and decide what to do with them later on. And again, so he's hobnobbing again with political higher-ups, people familiar with Pharaoh's court, in fact. And you're...
This just came up as much as that would have been bad for Joseph initially. It wasn't worse than when his brothers left him in the cistern.
Yeah.
If I could deal with that, I could deal with this.
Yeah, exactly. And he saw how the Lord had blessed him already as a slave, But now he's in a place where he's learning the political intrigue, the inside and outs of Pharaoh's household, as it were, of the business world, of the political climate of the day. Again, the Lord using this to teach him. All right, so let's go on. Potiphar's wife was persistent. How did this make the temptation Joseph faced particularly difficult?
There's no winning.
No. Why was there no win for him in this whole situation?
She had more power.
She was Potiphar's wife. He was a slave. And so she could do what? If he said no, if he refused, what could she do? Make his life miserable, which she ended up doing anyways. And so as you look at that, sins of infidelity and lust are particularly hard to resist, and they become harder to resist when the temptation is persistent. Also consider the fact that Potiphar's wife held considerable power in the household, and refusing her might have led to Joseph's demotion, sale to another slaveholder, or something worse, which of course was what had happened. And so again, here it's the master's wife. And basically, she had a lot of power, which she later on used in that. But again, very difficult in the face of temptation. And yet, Joseph didn't resort to worldly reason to resist Potiphar's wife, such as we might get caught, or what if you get pregnant. There was only one reason he resisted her temptation. What was that? Yeah. How can I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? It's against God. Committing adultery is against God's will, period. And so that was it. No, I'm not going to do it. So much so that he eventually had to run from this situation. I'm taking myself out of that situation that is there. And along the way, or just a little bit of a backup here, if she was that open in tempting him over and over and over again,
People overheard this, maybe they were around.
do you think Potiphar knew what his wife was like? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's why, again, what does he do? Throws him into king's prison. I'm not going to give him a real tough one. I know what my wife's like, but I still have to save face that is there. And so as we look at the next one, question number 3, what did Joseph get in return for his faithfulness to the Lord and his love for God's kingdom? I'm going to be faithful to the Lord. I'm going to serve the Lord. I'm going to do what is right before God. And now God should give me a pat on the back, a reward. And what did he get? Prison. Reduced from steward in Potiphar's household to a prisoner. He didn't get the reward. In other words, he had to bear a cross. Someone talked about having to bear crosses. Who was that? If you follow me, you have to pick up your cross and follow me. And that's what Joseph had to do. But again, notice what he's doing here. And he's in his mid-20s, and he's faced with this temptation, right in the, if you will, the prime of his sexual life, if you will. And yet the only thing he could think about was what? Disobeying God. Here's God. How can I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? We talked before, well, how did he know all about God? Again, go back to his being in the Father's house all those years and the learning that Jacob would have given him with all of that along the way. And so, again, goes from here down to here.
Did they have Job? Did they have the story of Job yet on Patmos?
I don't know. Job would have lived around the time, is speculated, I should say, to live around the time of Abraham. Did they have that in written form at that time? I don't know. I don't know. But they definitely didn't have the Pentateuch, Genesis through They had formal worship. And remember, God did speak to people too, and told them various things. God spoke to Joseph in the form of dreams and that. So again, how that was all transmitted, we are not told very, very much. Going on, read Genesis 39, 21 through 23, the last part, and then chapter 40. And why don't we turn to that? We'll look at the last part of chapter 39. But the Lord was with Joseph. Look at those important words. But Joseph is in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, even there. He showed mercy to him and gave him favor in the sight of the warden of the prison. The warden of the prison made Joseph responsible for all the prisoners who were in the prison. Joseph was responsible for whatever they did there. The warden of the prison did not pay attention to anything that was under his authority because the Lord was with Joseph, and the Lord made everything that he did succeed. So again, he goes into prison. Was he guilty of anything? Completely innocent. But he doesn't throw a pity party. He doesn't mope and complain and say, well, God, if you're putting me here now, I'm just going to sit here and do nothing. No, he was faithful again in all he did, no matter the situation, and the Lord blessed him. If you turn the sheet over, we get into Genesis chapter 40. Here's the whole purpose for him to be in the king's prison. Verse 1, sometime after this, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. He put them under custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And so, again, we're told they're under custody in the house of the captain of the guard. In other words, who ran the prison, the king's prison? Well, Joseph later on did under the warden. The warden ran it, but he didn't concern anything. But whose prison? It was the king's prison, but the custody was under the house of the captain of the guard, who happened to be Potiphar. So Potiphar's running the whole show there. He's overseeing that. He's running the king's prison, which is why Joseph ended up there, which again shows us what? Potiphar didn't believe his wife. And so, again, he was put in there in a favored position in prison where no slave should have gone. No slave should have been put there. This was for the cupbearer, the baker, political bigwigs and that. Verse 4, the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he was responsible for them. They stayed in prison for some time. Again, we'll talk about the timeline in just a little bit. While they were confined in the prison, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt each had a dream. Each man had his own dream during the same night. Each man's dream had its own meaning. Joseph came to them in the morning, looked at them, saw that they were troubled. He asked Pharaoh's officers who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so troubled today?" They said to him, "We each had a dream, but there is no one who can interpret it." All right, we each had a dream. Who had a dream before? Joseph. How many dreams did he have? Two dreams. Two dreams. And he knew it meant something, that this was God's will. Now, two people have dreams. How many dreams are there? Two. Later on, the outcome of all this is preparing for Joseph to get Pharaoh's attention. Pharaoh had dreams. How many dreams did he have? Two dreams. And again, number two in all this, and what later happens is Joseph alludes to the fact that two means that God's going to do it, that God's will is going to be done. And so he hears these two dreams, so he knows it means something very special. The last part of verse 8, Joseph said to them, interpretations belong to God, don't they? Please tell me the dreams. All right, so he starts it out. They say, we have dreams, no one's here to interpret it. What does he do? To whom does he point as far as dream interpretation goes? To God. But tell me, and why would he have them tell him if he says interpretations belong to God? Yeah. I worship God. And if it needs to be interpreted, God will help me interpret it. Verse 9, the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. In my dream there was a vine in front of me, and the vine had 3 branches. As I watched it, it budded, it blossomed, and in its clusters produced ripe grapes. I had Pharaoh's cup in my hand. I took the grapes, pressed them into the Pharaoh's cup, and handed the cup to Pharaoh. All right, so he's a cupbearer. His job is to hand the cup of wine to Pharaoh, making sure no one had poisoned it, etc. And he watched this vine blossom and have fruit on it, and he put that into Pharaoh's cup and handed it to Pharaoh. Joseph said to him, verse 12, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. But you will place Pharaoh's cup into his hand the way you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when everything is going well for you. Please show kindness to me and mention me to Pharaoh and bring me out of this jail, because I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and I have done nothing here to deserve to be put into the dungeon. And so he says within 3 days, Pharaoh's going to do what? Yeah, lift up your head. He's going to lift up your head in 3 days. You'll be restored to the same position. But now, what advice does he give him? Remember me. Because I'm unfairly in here, because unfairly what happened to me? I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and I've done nothing to deserve to be in this jail. So I was kidnapped, and so basically said, here's the whole thing. All of this was unfair. Verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. I saw 3 baskets of white bread on my head. In the top basket there were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds ate them out of the basket in my head. Verse 18, Joseph answered, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will do what? Notice it's the same phrase for what he said to the cupbearer. Will lift up your head, but will lift up your head from upon you, will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat flesh off of you. And so for the cupbearer, it was good news. For the baker, it was bad news. But the expression is the same. Lift up your head. Lift up your head. Verse 20. And so it was that on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, Pharaoh had a feast prepared for all his officials, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his officials. Again, the term lift up the head. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position again, and he again placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had explained to him. Nevertheless, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. All right. A step backwards or not? You look at this whole incident.
Well, later on, they'll tell Pharaoh.
Right.
The guy told me what my dream was.
But you look at this moment right now. God had given these 2 dreams that troubled them. They knew it meant something. God gave Joseph the ability to interpret those dreams, which meant what? The dreams were from God. And so now he told the chief cupbearer his dream. Remember me when you get out. I've been unfairly put in here. Tell people so that they can do something about it so that I get released. what would happen if the cupbearer said, "Oh, I'm so grateful that he got people to release Joseph"?
They'd start asking, well, how did he do this?
Well, he didn't get to Pharaoh.
He wouldn't be able to get that whole incident with Pharaoh and the telling of Pharaoh's dream. What would have happened? He would have been released. Where would he have gone then? Probably home. I was kidnapped from my homeland. He would have wanted to go back home, and what would have happened? The famine would have come, as we know the end of the story, and they wouldn't have been prepared. What would have meant for Jacob and his family? They would have starved to death. It couldn't be that way. He had to be forgotten in prison. It had to be that way. He didn't know it at the time. What do you think he was feeling immediately? Again? Again? This is the third time, you could say, he was kidnapped and made a slave, thrown in prison, and now forgotten in prison, even though after he did such a wonderful thing that was there. But again, we know this is all part of God's plan. He had everything, even when we don't know what's going on. What does the Lord say? Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you hope in a future. I know the plans I have for you. But Lord, it's not going according to my plans. The Lord says, that doesn't say, I know the plans you have for you. He says, I know the plans I have for you. And that was certainly true with Joseph in all of this. In Joseph's years in prison must have caused him a great degree of physical and spiritual suffering. Yet Joseph continues to put his life in the Lord's hands. He faithfully serves the Lord in the most difficult situation. We are going to stop there. We're at running out of time to get into number 4, but we'll start next time with number 4 of that and find out again how the Lord continued to train Joseph and how all this was working to get Joseph to the point where God could use him the way he wanted to. Any questions? We'll close with prayer. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us